Hi everyone. In this seminar, I'm going to be talking to you about whip speaking, which I think is probably one of the most crucial positions to be in any British parliamentary debate for a couple reasons. Most specifically because you have the final say for the most part in terms of what the judges are going to hear from the perspective of your team and the argumentation they've brought forth to the round. As well as other teams in the round, including front half. So just in terms of positionality, this makes whip speaking one of the most crucial roles and oftentimes one of the most misused, I would say, roles in terms of format, in terms of the ways in which people weigh and bring forth arguments and talk about them in the context of the round. So throughout this seminar, we're going to be doing a couple things in terms of key concepts that we're going to go over. So the first one's going to be about note-taking. We're also going to talk about burdens, meta-debating, rebuilding, clash, and weighing. And each of these are going to be explained in depth. So if at any time you need to pause the video and read, go ahead. I'll try to explain everything as neatly as possible. So the first concept we're going to be talking about is note-taking, and the reason I've put this first is because it's something that a lot of people don't actually utilize or engage in during the course of the debate, but it's super important, especially to the whip speaker role, because you're the last speaker. One of the expectations you have upon you is to summarize like key argumentation and clashes from teams, not just including the back half, but from the front half as well, and putting your arguments in the perspective of the entire debate. So what this requires in terms of note-taking is that you have thorough notes drawn up of every team in the round. And this also includes your own partner. And the reason it includes your own partner is because it is also your job to put their arguments in the context of the round. And what I mean by this is if an opposing team has dedicated their speech to taking down your partner's argument, but you don't know what necessarily it is your partner has said during their speech, it's going to be very difficult then for you to respond to those critiques of your case line. So it's important not just to pay attention to every team in the round that's on the opposition or maybe your front half, but also to your own partner and what your overall case line is in order to make your debate more cohesive between your two partners and to make sure that you have argumentation standing by the end of the round. So in terms of diligent note-taking, I think the best way to get better at this over time is to develop types of systems for yourself. So you're not just trying to copy everything down word for word. And what I mean by this is things necessary like format of paper. So for example, what I like to do is put the so if I'm listening to an opposition team, I'll put the opposition side here, and then with an arrow drawn, I'll put my response to those opposition points here. And I will do that for each speaker in the round and make sure that I have something written down, at least for the key argumentation that I think is most crucial in those speeches. And in terms of identifying what that is, I would say that if you take your opposing benches at their best and you put, I would say, good faith in listening and trying to interpret what their arguments actually are, then it's pretty easy to deduce which arguments they've given to you that are sort of crucial or actually relevant to the round, or not so much relevant at all. And I think like that comes with a bit of practice in terms of identifying those types of arguments, but it is super important to get as much of that information as possible and get it in a way that takes those opposition teams at their best. So this is a thing that comes with practice, but it is something that you have to be conscious of if you're going to be whip speaking. Okay, so the next concept we're going to talk about is actually called burdens. And if you don't actually know what a burden is, a pretty simple explanation is that it's a goal that's set either by the wording of a motion itself or by how a team decides to frame their arguments when they're giving their speech. And these burdens are something that in the context of a debate should be met in order for a team to win a round. So in any ideal scenario, the team that best fulfills whatever burdens they should have on a motion, they should theoretically win every round. This doesn't always happen, obviously. There are are times when burdens aren't necessarily something talked about at all. But if burdens are something that you bring attention to in your whip speeches, it can actually make adjudication for judges a lot simpler if they can realize, because you pointed out, that opposition teams haven't actually fulfilled their burdens. So when we're talking about burdens, these aren't necessarily things that are static. People all the time in rounds try to shift their burdens or change them, or just say that their burden is something incorrect that isn't necessarily what it should be in the context of a round. So I think the best advice I can give you for how you can identify burdens is to read the motion very, very thoroughly. And what I mean by that is oftentimes there are actor nouns or types of wording in the motion that makes the goals of each side of the debate pretty clear. So, for example, if the motion was this house would abolish private prisons. So if the motion is this house would abolish private prisons, I think, oh, yeah. So I think if the motion is this house would abolish private prisons, I think one of the key things that we can do to actually, like, I say, like, put burdens in the context of a motion is, so if we think about what the government team's goals are in talking about abolishing private prisons, I would say that the burdens that they would need to prove are that specifically within the context of the private prison system, the status quo of reform, or the status quo of, like, the reason we do have penal systems in a lot of places with private prison systems, that goal of, like, I would say, for example, rehabilitation, that goal isn't either being met by the current status quo prison system, and that the only way to solve that problem is to then do abolishment. So as you see, in terms of that burden I've set, I've linked it back to the motion in terms of, if we are going to abolish, if we are going to push through that policy that's been proposed in the motion, how necessarily then do we meet the criteria to actually do that? And I would say then that it's if the benefits of having a penal system are outweighed by all of the harms. And that's the burden that any gov team in that round will have to fulfill. And opposition essentially has to do the opposite. They have to prove that the benefits of a penal system or a private prison system are outweighed or are more important than abolishing it altogether, right? So those are kind of the ways in which you can think about burdens in the context of emotion. And that's kind of how you can identify them. But also, identifying burdens comes a lot with practice. But I would say, in terms of burdens in a whip speech, it's very important to sort of pay attention to whether or not an opposing team has fulfilled that burden. And if it hasn't been fulfilled, it's your job then on the whip speech to bring attention to the fact that that hasn't happened. And that's kind of going to bring us into this next point about meta debating, which is a kind of tricky concept to wrap your head around, because it requires the knowledge previous about burdens, but it's explaining to a judge why your team has won a round, but you're using concepts to explain that aren't just your case analysis or impacts or weighing, but you're bringing attention to things that your opposition teams have needed to do to win a round, but have failed to do. So for example, if we talk about the private prisons motion, if we talked about government teams' burden being about how the private prison system has such detrimental harms that we should just abolish the premise altogether, but they haven't proven why necessarily abolishment is the correct way to solve that problem, then that's something that you on a whip speaker need to be able to draw attention to, so that the judge understands that that opposition team hasn't fulfilled that burden, if that makes sense. So I would say then that there's other things just besides burdens, like if there's case tension, if one partner has said something that is contradictory to their other partner's speech, if there are two different lines of analysis, if, for example, an opposition team hasn't engaged at all with other teams in the round, if their debate is completely out of the realm of what the actual debate round should be, these are all things that you as a debater and a whip speaker need to be drawing attention to and allowing the judge to know that this has happened, because I would say that judges are human and are capable of missing things, especially given how long speeches can be and how much content can be in them. So I would say, just as a standard tip during whip speeches, don't assume that a judge has understood or picked up anything in a round. I think it's your job to explain everything that is being said by both your partner and yourself, and also explain why it is that you believe that opposition teams haven't done the things that they're supposed to do, and why that means that you then win the round. So that's basically it about meta debating. It's essentially just proving that you're right without actually talking about your own argumentation, but rather strategic things in the round that you've noticed, which is essentially why note-taking is also super important. So the next thing we're going to talk about is rebuilding. And this is another crucial step in whip speaking that a lot of times I see just not happen. And I think that given the fact that your opposition bench, the last 7 minutes that you've heard, was a person taking down all of your case argumentation, it's then your job to make sure that that isn't left unchallenged. And what I mean by that is, and why it's super important that you pay attention to what your partner is saying, is because in order to rebuild, you have to understand your core case line, right? Just because a whip speaker can't actually provide new material doesn't mean that they can't provide new analysis or new links or new impacts that would make the analysis presented by your partner more relevant in the context of the round. I would say, just as a standard tip, I look at your partner's speech in the same critical lens that you look at all of the other opposition speeches. If you notice holes in your partner's argumentation, or you notice that your partner has maybe missed an example or missed a link that you know that you can fill in, then it is your job on whip speech, like whip speech deliverance, to then fulfill that and to finish out those links and to make your argumentation more solid, because you're never going to be penalized for talking about something that your partner has already talked about, but like with a different lens of analysis or with different examples and different links. And again, this is why we talked about note-taking right at the onset and why it's super important, because there's all kinds of things that opposition teams can do to try to take down your partner's analysis, such as straw manning your arguments or just straight up lying about things that have been said. And it's important not to let those, even if you know maybe that the ways they've done that is in bad faith. If we go back before where I mentioned that you shouldn't ever assume that a judge has understood or knows something intuitively, you should also then always challenge these things and make sure that they don't get the last word on challenging your argumentation. So all of that is super important to not leave unsaid in whip speeches. And just in terms of all the other things you can do, we've already mentioned missing analysis, links, impacts, or examples. So be critical of your partner's speech when you're whip speaking, and it will help you understand where those arguments lie in the greater context of the round a lot easier, will help you fill in those missing links, all of that stuff. So if we move on to the next point then about clash. So this is the part of whip speaking where people would encourage you to have themes at the start of the round. And I like themes. I think themes are a really good way to start off a whip speech. I don't think they need to be explained super in depth when not in the context of the clash, though. And just a general tip about themes, when you're listing themes or overall points of clash about a round, make sure that the last theme you mention is your partner's extension. This does a couple things. One, it allows you to be in a position to better explain why necessarily that extension isn't derivative, which is something you're going to have to do a lot in whip speeches, is to explain why your argumentation or your extension is new, because oftentimes it might be unsaid or unchallenged or implied that your argumentation is new, but it's better to just explain it very clearly to just make sure there's no doubt in the judge's head as to what is derivative and what is not. And then the other thing that it does when you list your last theme to be your extension is it makes your extension framed as the most relevant material in the round, because then what you do in that theme is you explain why necessarily one, your extension point is most relevant, why it affects the most people, and why weighed against other teams in the round, it's going to be more impactful. And weighing is something we're going to get into very soon. And then also, um, make sure that in terms of clash, that the clash you're drawing attention to isn't just something that you think is a clash. It has to be something comparative. And what I mean by this is that the two arguments can't be about totally different things or totally different concepts. They have to be things that myself or a judge or any person watching or participating in the round can easily see that you can compare one thing against the other. So don't do apples and oranges in Clash. Try to compare things that are actually relevant to each other. And then I would say then the final point is that if you have Clash that isn't really comparable, and you notice that you've been thinking really hard trying to figure out exactly what the points of Clash are, but you have absolutely no idea what these are because you can't see yourself comparing to other opposition teams in the round. And if you're a government team, I think it's very easy for you to just blame the opposition for this. A simple one line about how their arguments aren't comparative and it's hard for you to engage with them makes yourself look like you're engaging more and makes the opposition teams look worse to the judges, especially if you're one of the teams getting the last word in. So I think it's super important if you think something isn't comparable that you draw attention to it. And I guess that's the overall tip for all aspects of a whip speech is if you're in doubt about whether or not a judge is buying a part of your argument, bring attention to it. Explain it more. Help a judge understand what you're seeing in your head, and that'll make your life and ultimately your success in BP rounds a lot better. So the other final part we're going to be talking about here is weighing, which I've mentioned earlier. And this is, I would say, the biggest thing that a lot of teams miss when they're doing their whip speeches, and or do incorrectly. And weighing isn't just saying that your argument is more important than the other team's argument. It's explaining exactly why it's true that your argument means more or is more impactful. So this can be done through a variety of ways. You can, for example, weigh in the context of, so for example, if we look at the example motion I have at the bottom here, or the example case line, which is if we're comparing maybe a loss of human life to economic damages, say this is a motion about reopening during coronavirus, right? I would say that an argument that you could make on a government team is to explain why the loss of human life on a large scale is more or less valuable than the economy, depending on what side of that motion you are on. So there are arguments to be made for, I would say the most intuitive, correct side of this weighing is that human life is probably more valuable than the larger scale economy, but you can make arguments that if the economy fails, human life is sacrificed as well, so that makes that clash or a little bit muddy. And the way you make it less muddy is through the weighing. So for example, if I'm on the side of human life and why it's valuable, I could, for example, give a practical argument saying human life is more valuable because if human lives are preserved, they could in fact stimulate the economy through their contributions to it. Ways in which you take that muddy clash where you're not sure which side is more valuable and you bring your side above the other in that weighing. So you have to make sure though that you do all of the weighing you can of the key points of clash in the round, which is why we talked about identifying that clash before, because if you leave weighing unsaid, or if you decide not to weigh certain points of clash, and neither team maybe from government or opposition decides to do that, then it's entirely up to the adjudicators to do that weighing themselves, right? So I think that the more clearly you can paint that picture for judges, the easier it is for judges to adjudicate in your favor and have you win rounds, because that isn't legwork that they're necessarily going to have to do themselves in their judge period, right? So I think at that point, if you can make sure that you do all of the weighing you can and you don't leave things unsaid, you leave as little doubt in the mind of judges as possible, and you give yourself the best chance of success by the end. So that's about it. That's all of my tips on whip speaking. I hope you all learned something. Have a good day.